The EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network presents Vatican Insider with Joan Lewis. Each week, Joan brings you news from inside the Vatican and the Church around the world, as well as interviews and answers to your questions. Now, here's the host of Vatican Insider, Joan Lewis.
Welcome to Vatican Insider on this third weekend of Lent. No guest this weekend in the interview segment. Rather, we are airing a special I've prepared on a Lenten tradition that is unique to Rome, the Lenten station churches. I offer a mini pilgrimage of sorts as we visit some of the station churches in Rome. Very special churches that tell a beautiful story over the 40 days of Lent, a story found only in Rome. Every year on Ash Wednesday and the start of Lent, popes process from the Benedictine Church of Sant'Anselmo on the Aventine Hill to the nearby Dominican Basilica of Santa Sabina, and Santa Sabina thus becomes the first of the station churches in Rome, and the way to renew a centuries-old tradition of celebrating Mass every day in Lent at what are known here, as I said, as station or stational churches. If you're ever in Rome during Lent and want to go to 7 a.m. Mass at one of the station churches, you can always find the Mass schedule at www.pnac.org/station churches. When you tune into this special, you will understand how the North American College, PNAC, is so involved in this tradition. Now, let's look at the news of the week, starting as I have done in recent weeks, with an update on Pope Francis's health. The latest report on Pope Francis came Wednesday evening, March 19th, when the Holy See Press Office announced that Pope Francis no longer requires mechanical ventilation at night and has less need of high-flow oxygen therapy during the day. His motor and respiratory physiotherapy is also making progress. The report said the Holy Father's clinical condition is confirmed to be improving. The Holy Father has suspended non-invasive mechanical ventilation and also has less need of high-flow oxygen therapy. Motor and respiratory physiotherapy is continuing to make progress. This morning, on the Solemnity of St. Joseph, the Holy Father concelebrated Mass. The Pope's doctors have said that his lung infections are under control, although not eliminated. The values of his clinical analyses are in the normal range, and the Pope continues to be fever-free. He spent his day, March 19, receiving treatment, praying, and doing some work. No decision has yet been made regarding who will preside over liturgies during Holy Week. Since the Pope's condition is stable, says this update of March 19, the next update on his health is expected no earlier than next week. The Holy See Press Office will, however, give some general information to journalists on Friday and again next Monday. Pope Francis has been receiving treatment for double pneumonia at Rome's Gemelli Hospital since February 14th. Now, I want to highlight one sentence, quote, "Since the Pope's condition is stable, the next update on his health is expected no earlier than next week. The Holy See Press Office will give some general information to journalists on Friday and again next Monday." Now, I record the news segment of VI on Friday morning in Rome, so this week's edition will not include the Friday evening briefing, but it will be on my blog, Joan's Rome, and my Facebook page. Now, let's look at the other news of the week. Sunday, March 16th. Pope Francis's prepared remarks at the Angelus were printed in the press office bulletin as in past weeks. They were very personal and moving as he highlighted his current health challenge, and I want to quote at length. "I'm sharing these thoughts with you," writes Pope Francis, "while I'm facing a period of trial, and I join with so many brothers and sisters who are sick, fragile at this time, like me. Our bodies are weak, but even like this, nothing can prevent us from loving, praying, giving ourselves, being for each other in faith, shining signs of hope. How much light shines in this sense in hospitals and places of care. How much loving care illuminates the rooms, the corridors, the clinics, the places where the humblest services are performed. And that's why I want to invite you today to join me in praising the Lord, who never abandons us and who in times of sorrow places people beside us who reflect a ray of his love. The last time Pope Francis personally delivered the Angelus Reflections was February 9th. Also last Sunday, Pope Francis expressed his profound condolences and assured people of his spiritual closeness to the injured following the tragic fire that broke out overnight at a nightclub in Kokani, North Macedonia, when 59 people died in the disaster and 155 were injured. The Pope's words came in a telegram signed by Cardinal Pietro Parolin, Secretary of State, addressed to Bishop Kiro Stojanov of Skopje. In the message, Pope Francis assured his remembrance in prayer for those who lost their lives, and he invoked the Lord's comfort for those suffering from the consequences of such a difficult hardship. Now, Sunday's big news story came in the evening when the Vatican released a photo of the Holy Father, stating that morning he had concelebrated Mass in the chapel of his hospital suite. Pope Francis is seen from the back, sitting in a wheelchair, head bent slightly forward, and seeming to look at the altar. He is wearing a purple stole. No other person is in the photo. He is not wearing the oxygen nose cannula. This is the first and only photo we have seen of Pope Francis since his hospitalization began on February 14th. And concelebration, by the way, means he celebrated Mass with one or more priests. Moving to Tuesday, March 18th, the Vatican published a letter from Pope Francis to Luciano Fontana, editor-in-chief of the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera. This is something he wrote in response to Fontana's message of support during the Pope's illness. In the letter, the Pope asks Fontana to relaunch and amplify his appeal for peace and disarmament. Quote, "I would like to encourage you and all those who dedicate their work and intelligence to communication through the tools that now connect our world in real time, to feel the full importance of words. They are never just words. They are facts that shape human environments. They can connect or divide, serve the truth, or use it for other ends. We must disarm words. We must disarm minds and disarm the earth. There is a great need for reflection, calmness, and an awareness of complexity." End quote. Wednesday, March 19th, Feast of St. Joseph. March 19th is an official holiday in the Vatican. This year it marked the 12th anniversary of the official inauguration of Pope Francis's pontificate. On March 19th, the Vatican released Pope Francis's prepared catechesis for the weekly general audience, beginning a new series of reflections on Jesus' encounters with various individuals in the Gospel as part of his larger catechetical cycle on the life of Jesus, our hope. These are encounters that enlighten life and bring hope, the Pope writes, beginning with the meeting of Jesus and Nicodemus, a man whose story shows it's possible to come out of the darkness and find the courage to follow Christ. In the Gospel of St. John, Nicodemus, a Pharisee and a leader of the Jewish people, first comes to Jesus in the night, but ultimately boldly comes to Pilate to request Jesus' body after the crucifixion. Francis explains that in John's Gospel, the night likely symbolizes the darkness of the doubts in Nicodemus' heart. If you are in the dark, he says, of course you look for the light. Nicodemus therefore seeks Jesus because he has sensed that he can illuminate the darkness of his heart. At first, however, Nicodemus cannot understand what Jesus tells him because he continues to think with his own logic and categories. He feels the need for change, but does not know where to start. This happens to all of us at some point in our life, says the Pope. Life lies in the ability to change in order to find a new way of loving, which Jesus calls a new birth in his conversation with Nicodemus. Also Wednesday, Pope Francis released his message for the 62nd World Day of Prayer for Vocations, which falls on May 11th. He invites young people to listen to God's voice in their hearts so they may be signs of His love for our world. The message, entitled Pilgrims of Hope, the Gift of Life, recalls that every vocation, be it to ordained ministry, consecrated life, or the laity, should offer the world a sign of God's hope for every person. At certain points in life, added the Pope, God calls people to choose a path, whether it be to family life, the priesthood, or religious life. Every vocation is inspired by hope, marked by confident trust in God's providence. Vocations mature through the daily effort to be faithful to the gospel and through prayer, discernment, and service. Now, as we go to press, those are the news highlights of the week, but stay right here for the Q&A on how the date of Easter is calculated. Then my special report on Rome's celebrated Lenten station churches. Welcome to this week's Q&A. Now, given that we are in Lent and working our way to Easter Sunday, I look at the question people have asked for years. Because it's a movable feast, how is the date chosen for Easter Sunday? Okay, now you have to listen carefully. There's a lot of information here. The answer comes from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. We start with paragraph 1169. This is the why of Easter. Therefore, Easter is not simply one feast among others, but the feast of feasts, the solemnity of solemnities, just as the Eucharist is the sacrament of sacraments, the great sacrament. St. Athanasius calls Easter the Great Sunday, and the Eastern churches call Holy Week the Great Week. The mystery of the resurrection, in which Christ crushed death, permeates with its powerful energy our old time until all is subjected to Him. And that's end quote. Now, paragraph 1170. This is the when of Easter. At the Council of Nicaea in 325, all the churches agreed that Easter, the Christian Passover, should be celebrated on the Sunday following the first full moon after the vernal equinox. Because of the different methods of calculating this moon, the date of Easter in the Western and Eastern churches is not always the same. The churches are currently seeking an agreement in order once again to celebrate the day of the Lord's resurrection on a common date. Okay, I mentioned equinox. What is an equinox? There are 2 equinoxes every year, in March and September, when the sun shines directly on the equator and the length of night and day are nearly equal. March is the vernal equinox. The March or vernal equinox marks the moment the sun crosses the celestial equator from south to north. In the northern hemisphere, this happens on March 19, 20, or 21 every year. This year, 2025, that equinox fell on March 20th. In the southern hemisphere, this happens from September 21 to 25. On the Gregorian calendar, the one that we use, Easter is the first Sunday after the Paschal full moon, which is the first full moon on or after March 21st. Easter thus always falls between March 22nd and April 25th. Now, here's some March or vernal equinox trivia. The March equinox can occur as early as March 19th, which happened most recently in 1796 and will happen again in 2044. And it can occur as late as March 21st, which happened most recently in 2007, and will happen again in 2102. So now, if people ask you about the date of Easter, are you ready to answer? And by the way, don't worry. I'll also print this out for you on my blog, Jones Rome.
Mother Angelica had a simple goal when she began EWTN: to reach the world with the gospel message. Today, EWTN offers an online learning series, its own YouTube channel, the daily Mass and devotionals, and audio and video on demand. We've never wavered from our mandate to proclaim the truth and majesty of the Catholic faith. Thank you for joining EWTN in this mission.
Hi, this is Mike Aquilina with a few words about St. Agnes of Rome. She was a teen or tween when she refused a marriage proposal. She could not marry because she had consecrated herself to Jesus. Her jilted suitor denounced her as a Christian, and she was condemned. Agnes's courage in facing death was a major factor in the conversion of Rome.
Welcome back to Vatican Insider. Here's Joan Lewis.
Welcome back to Vatican Insider. Because we've just started Lent, this weekend in what is normally the interview segment, I offer a mini pilgrimage of sorts as we visit some of the Lenten station churches in Rome. Very special churches that tell a beautiful story over the 40 days of Lent, a story found only in Rome. Every year on Ash Wednesday and the start of Lent, popes process from the Benedictine Church of Sant'Anselmo on the Aventine Hill to the nearby Dominican Basilica of Santa Sabina, thus renewing a centuries-old Roman tradition of celebrating Mass at what are known here as Lenten station or stational churches. At Sant'Anselmo, there's always a moment of prayer. This is followed by the penitential procession to the Basilica of Santa Sabina. Traditionally joining the Pope in the procession are cardinals, archbishops, bishops, the Benedictine monks of Sant'Anselmo, the Dominican fathers of Santa Sabina, and lay faithful. In Santa Sabina, the first of the 40 station churches, the Holy Father then presides at Mass, and after his homily, there is the rite of the blessing and imposition of ashes. In conclusion, the Pope imparts his apostolic blessing. In 2021, because of concerns of contagion, if crowds gathered for this traditional event, thus potentially spreading the coronavirus, no afternoon procession was scheduled. Rather, at 9:30 in the morning, Pope Francis presided at Mass and the distribution of ashes at the altar of the chair in St. Peter's Basilica. Another change prompted by COVID-19 last year came in a January 12th note from the Congregation for Divine Worship that detailed how ashes are to be distributed. Priests will bless the ashes, sprinkle them with holy water, and say one of two formulas: repent and believe in the gospel, or remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Sanitizing his hands and wearing a mask, the priest will then silently sprinkle ashes on the head of each faithful, not on foreheads, as is traditional in a few countries. This year, 2022, because of acute knee pain, Pope Francis was advised by doctors not to preside at the procession and Mass in Santa Sabina. In his stead was Cardinal Secretary of State Pietro Parolin. Our pilgrimage of station churches thus starts at Santa Sabina, in the elegant Aventine neighborhood that overlooks the Circus Maximus and the Baths of Caracalla. Situated on the Aventine's Piazza Pietro di Liria, the Basilica of Santa Sabina, chronologically the first Lenten station church, was established at the start of the 5th century by a priest named Peter who was from Illyria. In 1222, Pope Honorius III gave the adjacent ancient turreted palace of the Crescenzi family to the Dominicans as a monastery. And in fact, over the years, both Saints Dominic and Thomas Aquinas lived here. Modifications and additions in the 16th century basilica altered its appearance. In the early 1900s, the church was restored to its original design. It has 3 aisles and 24 fluted Corinthian columns. Little is left of the original mosaics. In the middle of the nave is the mosaic tombstone dedicated to Munoz de Zamora, Master General of the Dominicans and a biographer of St. Dominic. Adjacent to the church is the cloister built by St. Dominic in 1220 and restored between 1936 and 1939. The practice of station churches had its origins in the first centuries of Christianity, when most of the early popes celebrated the liturgy on special liturgical feast days at special churches in the Eternal City. This eventually became principally a Lenten devotion. In his liturgical reform, Pope St. Gregory the Great, who reigned from 590 to 604, established a station church for each day of Lent, thus making the whole season a pilgrimage on the path to conversion while preparing for Easter. The first station church, as I said, every year is always Santa Sabina, where the Pope celebrates Ash Wednesday Mass. In the early days of the Church, Lent was a time in which catechumens began their journey of faith and conversion prior to receiving baptism. The word station is associated with two Latin words, stare, meaning to stand, and statio, meaning standing still or a stationary place. In early times, the celebrations began with clergy and congregation gathering at one spot called the collecta and processing to the station church, statio, while reciting litanies and other prayers. The Eucharist was then celebrated at the station church. And by the way, our word collect, not collect, is related to this early gathering. Today, the collect is a prayer that concludes the opening rites of the Mass. The celebrant says, "Let us pray," the faithful rise, and the collect is recited, a prayer to God that is drawn from the readings or feast of the day, or the purpose for which the Mass is being offered. The collect always precedes the first reading, that is the start of the liturgy of the Word. Unfortunately, the custom I mentioned earlier began to fall into disuse, and it stopped when the papacy was in Avignon from 1309 to 1377. It was revived by Pope St. John XXIII in 1959. The 7 a.m. Masses in English at a different church each day in Rome have become a gathering spot for English-speaking Catholics. Any given day of Lent will find priests, Roman seminarians, religious from around Rome, embassy personnel, very often ambassadors, some of whom speak English only as a second or even a third language. Also coming are university students and other members of the laity, all gathered together to celebrate the Eucharist. Masses in other languages, including German, Latin, and Italian, are celebrated at other times in the station churches. Not long after John XXIII revived this custom, the rector, staff, and seminarians of the Pontifical North American College, the American Seminary in Rome, began to frequent the Lenten station churches, attending Mass each morning at 7 in English at the assigned church of the day. Now, all these years later, they still observe this Lenten custom and on most days walk to the church from the college located on Janiculum Hill. On some days, that is a very arduous undertaking and means a very early wake-up alarm. In addition to the station churches, a long-standing Roman custom is to visit the 4 major or papal basilicas, St. Peter's, St. John Lateran, St. Mary Major, and St. Paul's outside the walls. All this in addition to 3 more important basilicas in what is commonly called the 7-church walk. The 3 additional basilicas are Holy Cross in Jerusalem, St. Lawrence outside the walls, also known as St. Lawrence al Verano, and St. Sebastian. The 7-church walk is traditionally done on the Wednesday of Holy Week. In preparation for welcoming pilgrims on its designated day in Lent, each station church gets spruced up in some fashion for the morning Mass. There's extra dusting and polishing of pews and altars, and probably a lot of sanitizing in COVID times. And in some cases, precious relics that are usually housed away from the visitor's eyes are brought out and displayed for veneration. Many churches, however, have relics that are on display all year round. I read somewhere that 25 of the 40 station churches were once the homes of Romans who converted to Christianity. Now, some of the relics you'll be able to see if you follow the station churches in Rome include Sant'Agostino in Campo Marzio. Above the main altar, there's an image of a Byzantine Madonna that came from the Church of Santa Sofia in Constantinople, and that's modern Istanbul. In the chapel named for her, we find the remains of St. Monica, mother of St. Augustine. The relics of many other saints are found below the main altar and near other altars. On August 27, 2018, returning to Rome after his trip to Ireland, Pope Francis stopped here to pray at the tomb of St. Monica, whose feast day it was. This is very close, by the way, to Piazza Navona. Now, if you go to Santa Cecilia, St. Cecilia in Trastevere, you'll see the body of St. Cecilia, which lies in the crypt. Sarcophagi with the bodies of Saints Valerian, Tiburcio, and Massima are found here, as is a sarcophagus with the bodies of Saints Pope Lucio I and Urban. If you go to the Church of San Clemente, run by the Irish Dominicans, we are now looking at millennia-old church history here. The present basilica was built just before the year 1100 during the Middle Ages, and beneath that is a 4th century basilica that had once been the home of a Roman nobleman. In addition, part of that home had once been an early church. The church was built over the home of Pope St. Clement, the 3rd pope after St. Peter, and his relics are beneath the main altar, together with an arm of St. Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch. In the underground part of the church is the sepulchre of St. Cyril, apostle to the Slavs, whose relics are in the upper church in a chapel on the right side. San Marcello. Now in this church we see the remains of Pope St. Marcello in an urn beneath the main altar. In the 4th chapel on the left, in an urn in the altar, are the relics of Saints Felicity and her 7 sons. Remember that story? In the chapel of the Crucifix are relics of, among others, Saint Longinus, whose sword pierced the side of Christ at the crucifixion. Relics of many other saints are in this church. Santa Maria in Violata. Tradition says that Saints Peter and Paul and the evangelists, Saints John and Luke, at one point spent time in a residence here, and that St. Paul wrote his letters to the Hebrews and St. Luke the Acts of the Apostles. San Pietro in Vincoli, St. Peter's in Chains, is a beautiful church, and in a beautiful glass and brass reliquary are the chains that bound St. Peter when he was in prison. These are just a few of the many treasures you will find as you live the Lenten Station Church's pilgrimage. A wonderful site to explore for the full list of these Lenten churches is that of the North American College that I mentioned earlier. www.pnac.org/station-churches. I wish you a beautiful, peaceful, healthy, bountiful Lent.
For more information on these stories, or to check out Joan's blog and to ask her a question, go to EWTN.com. That's EWTN.com. Thanks for listening to Vatican Insider on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.